Before the world knew him as the fearless polar bear of the North, Hugh Rowland was just a tough kid growing up in rural Canada, learning to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. His story didn't begin with fame or cameras. It began with grit, dirt under his nails, and the icy breath of the northern wilderness in his lungs. At just 6 years old, he was already behind the wheel of a grain truck. Too small to reach the pedals from the seat, he had to stand up to drive. That early exposure to hard work shaped him. By 11, he was hustling at a construction site and saving up his own money to buy cattle. Where most kids saw chores as a burden, Hugh saw a path forward, one that led straight into the dangerous world of ice road trucking. The ice roads of Canada are no place for the weak. Stretching across frozen lakes and remote tundra, these routes are as beautiful as they are deadly. For Hugh, they were home. He spent more than 30 years battling brutal winters and thin ice, hauling massive loads across ground that could collapse beneath him at any moment. And he didn't just survive, he dominated. They called him the polar bear for a reason. He was known for charging through snowstorms and dared to take on routes others feared. Even after suffering frostbite that nearly cost him his fingertips, Hugh kept driving. His face, scarred by cold and time, became one of the most recognizable on the ice. His name became synonymous with strength, endurance, and the unshakable will to keep moving. But trucking wasn't just a job, it was an obsession. Hugh didn't stop when the road ended. He helped build the very ice roads he drove on. He knew how to read the surface, how to listen for the cracks, how to sense danger before it struck. Even with temperatures plunging to 60 below, he'd keep his window cracked open just to hear the ice breathe. His company, R&R Hose Service, became one of the most respected outfits in the region. He wasn't just hauling freight, he was leading crews, managing logistics, and training new drivers. He knew the risks better than anyone. Over the years, Hugh lost dozens of friends and family to the ice. But instead of walking away, he doubled down. Those losses fueled his mission to teach others how to survive where so many didn't. By the time television came calling, Hugh Rowland was already a legend among truckers. The cameras would only reveal what those in the North already knew. There was no one tougher than the polar bear. And once the world saw him in action, everything would change. But the fame, as it turned out, would be just the beginning, not the end. When Ice Road Truckers first aired, the concept sounded like something out of a survival show. Massive trucks barreling across frozen lakes, every trip a gamble between payday and disaster. But what the producers couldn't have planned for was Hugh Rowland. From the very first episode, he stole the screen with his gruff voice, fearless attitude, and unfiltered honesty. This wasn't some carefully managed TV personality. This was the real deal. Hugh didn't play a character. He was the character. While other drivers second-guessed routes or hesitated before a sketchy patch of ice, Hugh charged ahead. He took the biggest loads, chose the most dangerous routes, and made it all look easy. But that wasn't bravado. It was confidence built on decades of surviving the impossible. Viewers could sense that. He wasn't reckless. He was calculated, experienced, and brutally efficient. As the show gained momentum, so did Hugh's reputation. Fans quickly gravitated toward his no-nonsense attitude. He didn't sugarcoat the job. He wasn't interested in drama for the camera. And he sure as hell didn't care what anyone thought of him. That made him relatable. While the show introduced many memorable drivers over the years, Rowland remained the one constant fans couldn't forget. But he wasn't just a star, he was a boss. Off camera, he owned the trucks, hired the drivers, and managed the risks. He wasn't just risking his life every time he hit the road, he was responsible for the lives and livelihoods of everyone on his payroll. That weight shaped his every decision. When he clashed with rookie drivers or challenged others on safety, it wasn't just tough talk. It was survival. One thing that set Hugh apart was how little he relied on theatrics. He didn't need a gimmick to be interesting. Every time he hit the road, there was real danger. Every crack in the ice, every shifting load, every sudden wideout could end everything in seconds. And yet, he kept going. Where others saw risk, he saw routine. That quiet confidence made him a legend. But behind the camera, there were already signs that the pressure was mounting. Rowland's unfiltered nature didn't always sit well with producers. He wasn't afraid to challenge how things were edited or how the show portrayed the drivers. At times, it was clear he felt the reality of ice road trucking was being twisted for drama. And if there was one thing Hugh Rowland wouldn't tolerate, it was fakery. Still, he stuck with it season after season, hauling massive loads, mentoring rookies, and showing the world what true northern grit looked like. His presence anchored the show. Without him, the stakes wouldn't have felt as real. But just as his TV fame peaked, something was brewing behind the scenes. A series of conflicts, some professional, others deeply personal, would soon put him on a collision course with disaster. And when it hit, it wouldn't just end his time on TV. It would change his life forever. The cameras never captured everything. While Hugh Rowland was winning fans on screen with his no-nonsense attitude and raw skill, the environment off-camera was a very different story. Tensions were rising, between drivers, producers, and even within Hugh's own team. And slowly, the cracks began to show. From the beginning, Hugh ran his operation like a general in a war zone. He didn't have time for excuses, shortcuts, or second-guessing. If you worked for him, you pulled your weight, or you were out. That made him a polarizing figure. Some drivers admired his leadership. Others felt the pressure was too intense, too aggressive. But Hugh wasn't there to be liked. He was there to get the job done, and he expected the same from everyone around him. That philosophy clashed hard with the show's format. As ice road truckers evolved, the producers started focusing more on interpersonal drama, arguments, rivalries, and big personalities clashing on screen. Hugh, with his short temper and blunt delivery, was a natural lightning rod. He clashed openly with other drivers, especially those who didn't meet his standards or questioned his judgment. These weren't staged arguments, they were real. And sometimes they turned personal. One of the most well-known feuds on the show was between Hugh and fellow driver Rick Yem. The two had started off with a friendly dynamic, but things soured quickly. Rick accused Hugh of neglecting truck maintenance and putting his drivers at risk. Hugh, never one to back down, fired back with his usual fire and fury. The tension exploded into one of the show's most talked-about moments when Rick quit mid-season, refusing to drive for Hugh any longer. To viewers, it was gripping television. But to Hugh, it was frustrating. He wasn't trying to make a TV show, he was running a business in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. The cameras were just an added burden. And the more the show focused on the drama, the more disconnected it felt from the reality he lived every day. The risk, the loss, the life-or-death stakes. It was all too real to be turned into entertainment. Despite the pressure, Hugh kept driving. But behind the scenes, he was becoming more vocal about his dissatisfaction. He challenged producers. He pushed back on how scenes were edited. He wanted the truth to be told, not a scripted version of reality. That resistance, combined with his fiery personality, didn't sit well with the powers behind the show. Meanwhile, the physical toll of the job was starting to catch up with him. Years of brutal conditions, close calls, and sleepless nights on the road were weighing heavy. But no one could have predicted what was about to happen next. Because the next conflict Hugh would face wouldn't be with another driver, or even with the producers. It would come from someone much closer. And it would take place not on the ice, but on the highway. And in just a few terrifying seconds, everything Hugh Rowland had built would be shattered. It was supposed to be just another ride. For someone like Hugh Rowland, who'd spent decades navigating the deadliest roads in the world, a quick trip down a paved highway should have been nothing. But fate doesn't care how tough you are or how many close calls you've survived. In a split second, everything Hugh had built, fought for, and risked his life to protect came crashing down. The accident happened far from the ice roads that made him famous. Hugh wasn't behind the wheel this time. He was in the passenger seat of his own truck, a ride he'd taken countless times before. But this drive ended violently. The truck veered off the road and smashed into a ditch at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. Hugh's body was thrown around a cab like a rag doll, and the injuries were immediate and devastating. Broken bones, crushed nerves, internal trauma. Hugh survived, but barely. The wreck didn't just break his body, it shattered the life he knew. For a man who had built his entire identity on power, control, and fearlessness, the aftermath was a nightmare. He couldn't walk. He couldn't work. The polar bear was suddenly caged in his own body. But the worst part? The driver that day wasn't some stranger or reckless rookie. It was one of his closest friends, a man he trusted. A man who, according to Hugh, had been speeding recklessly just before the crash. And as the reality set in, Hugh's pain turned to anger. The fallout was immediate. Hugh filed a lawsuit against his former friend, claiming the crash was caused by gross negligence. But this wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal. About losing everything because of someone else's choices. About watching your entire life's work crumble in a matter of seconds. The courtroom battle exposed the raw wounds left behind, both physical and emotional. But even more painful than the trial was what came after. In the wake of the crash, Hugh was quietly cut from Ice Road Truckers. There was no big send-off, no tribute, no proper goodbye. One of the show's most iconic figures was gone, just like that. Fans were confused. Many didn't even know what had happened. One episode, he was there, loud, tough, unstoppable. The next, he vanished. Behind the scenes, Hugh was fighting not just for justice, but for his dignity. The injuries had left him unable to work the same way he once did. The trucking empire he built began to fade. The man who'd once led crews across frozen wastelands now struggled with the basics of everyday life. And through it all, he carried the bitterness of a life interrupted, not by nature, not by the ice, but by a moment of carelessness he couldn't control. But even as he recovered, something deeper had shifted. The polar bear had been wounded, not just in body, but in spirit. And yet, this wasn't the end. Because Hugh Rowland wasn't built to disappear quietly. For most people, an accident like the one Hugh Rowland survived would have been the end of the story. A devastating crash, life-altering injuries, and a career abruptly ripped away. Those things break people. But Hugh wasn't like most people. Even as the pain lingered and the cameras moved on, he wasn't ready to fade into the background. Not yet. Recovery was brutal. Hugh had suffered major injuries. His pelvis was crushed, his legs damaged, and his body left in a state no one, not even him, recognized. Walking was a challenge. Climbing into a truck cab was nearly impossible. For a man who had lived his life on the edge of the Arctic, defined by physical strength and mental toughness, the new reality felt like a prison. He spent months confined to a hospital bed. Then came physical therapy, day after day of agonizing progress, setbacks, and frustration. But Hugh refused to give up. Doctors warned him he might never fully recover, but he didn't want sympathy. He wanted his life back. And behind the scenes, he was quietly planning a comeback, not to Ice Road Truckers, but as something even more personal, his identity. Stripped of the road, the fame, and the empire he'd built, Hugh turned his focus inward. He began speaking out more, publicly addressing the crash, the lawsuit, and the way the show had left him behind. His words were raw and honest. He didn't hold back. He talked about betrayal, about pain, and about what it felt like to be tossed aside by the very machine he helped build. But Hugh wasn't looking for pity. He was demanding accountability. For him, the crash wasn't just a freak accident. It was negligence. And being cut from Ice Road Truckers in the aftermath only made it worse. It felt like they wanted to erase him. But he wouldn't let that happen. Online, fans began to rally. People who had grown up watching him battle blizzards and frozen lakes wanted answers. They wanted to know where Hugh had gone and why. And as the buzz grew louder, Hugh found a new kind of platform. No longer tied to a network or a script, he could speak directly to his supporters. And he did. He posted updates, shared memories, and even teased the idea of returning to trucking in some form. But even more than that, he began to reflect on what he had learned. He opened up about the sacrifices he made, years spent away from family, friends lost to the road, the physical and emotional cost of a life lived in extremes. This was a side of Hugh few had seen before. Beneath the rough exterior, the bravado, and the bluster, there was a man still fighting, not for fame, but for purpose. And although he couldn't erase what had happened, he was determined to shape what came next. Because Hugh Rowland knew one thing for certain: you don't survive the ice roads by giving up when things get tough. After Hugh Rowland vanished from Ice Road Truckers, the show kept rolling. New drivers were brought in. New routes were explored. The producers tried to maintain the high-stakes energy that had made the series a hit. But for longtime fans, something felt off. The heart of the show, the raw grit and tension Hugh brought, was suddenly gone, and no one was talking about it. There was no official statement from the network. No explanation. Just a quiet erasure of one of the series' most important figures. Viewers noticed. Questions flooded online forums and comment sections. Where's Hugh? What happened to the polar bear? Why hasn't anyone mentioned the accident? But the silence was intentional. Behind the scenes, there were likely legal reasons for the lack of acknowledgement. With Hugh's lawsuit pending, the producers and network probably wanted to avoid any public comment that could complicate things. Still, to fans, it felt like a betrayal. A man who had risked his life to bring authenticity to the screen was being written out of his own story. The show moved forward, but it wasn't the same. Without Hugh's intensity, the rivalries between drivers felt forced. The danger still existed, but the emotional weight was missing. Hugh didn't just drive trucks, he brought stakes. His presence made every decision feel like a gamble, every trip feel like a mission. Without him, Ice Road Truckers became just another reality show about tough jobs. What made it worse was the industry's quiet complicity. Other cast members rarely spoke about Hugh publicly. Whether out of loyalty to contracts, fear of legal blowback, or personal fallout from the incident, they kept their distance. It was as if a line had been drawn, Hugh was out, and talking about him was off limits. But the fans didn't forget. In online spaces, Hugh's name kept coming up. His accident became one of the show's most whispered about moments, an unofficial part of the Ice Road Truckers mythos. People speculated about the crash, the lawsuit, the silence from the network. And the more the show tried to move on, the more obvious his absence became. For Hugh, the silence likely cut deep. Not because he needed the spotlight, but because he had given everything to that show. The risk, the leadership, the legacy. To be dismissed without a word felt like erasure. But he refused to let that be the end of his story. Instead of retreating, Hugh began shaping his own narrative outside of TV. He didn't need a network to validate him. He had the scars to prove what he'd survived. And even if the industry stayed silent, his fans were still listening. And while the show carried on without him, the shadow of the polar bear loomed large. Because for many, Ice Road Truckers had two eras, before Hugh's exit and after. Even though Hugh Rowland was no longer on screen, his presence never really disappeared. To millions of fans, he wasn't just a reality TV star. He was a symbol of grit, resilience, and unfiltered truth. Long after the network tried to move on without him, Hugh's legacy only grew stronger. Because what he built wasn't just for television, it was real, and it mattered. Before Ice Road Truckers, most people had no idea what these drivers went through. The isolation, the extreme weather, the split-second decisions that meant life or death, none of it was common knowledge. Hugh changed that. He didn't just show the job, he lived it, and he made the audience feel it. Every slammed door, every heated exchange, every inch of frozen road, it all told a story that was bigger than him. And it resonated. Young drivers looked up to him. Veterans respected him. And everyday viewers who had never touched a rig in their lives found themselves captivated by his determination. He showed that being tough wasn't about being reckless. It was about discipline, focus, and pushing through when everything stacked against you. Even off camera, Hugh continued to make an impact. After the accident, he became an unexpected voice for safety in trucking. While he wasn't out giving speeches or leading public campaigns, his story served as a cautionary tale. One split second of bad judgment on the road, even by someone you trust, can end everything. For those in the industry, Hugh's crash became a reminder of how quickly things can turn and how important it is to never let your guard down. And then there was his business legacy. Though his trucking operation took a hit after the accident, the mark he left on the ice roads didn't fade. The drivers who trained under him carried his methods. His approach to risk management, team leadership, and no-nonsense trucking became a blueprint for many. Even those who didn't always agree with him respected the results he got. Hugh also became a quiet example of how to rebuild a life after loss. While many fans were focused on the crash and the show, those who looked closer saw something else. A man who refused to let tragedy define him. He didn't play the victim. He didn't beg for a comeback. Instead, he focused on what he could still control: his voice, his values, and his pride. In many ways, the network's silence only strengthened his mystique. While they moved on with new faces and manufactured drama, Hugh stood as a reminder of what the show used to be: raw, dangerous, and real. And every time fans went back to watch the early seasons, they were reminded of just how much weight he carried. Because some legacies can't be written out. Some names are burned into the ice. And Hugh Rowland was never just another trucker. On screen, Hugh Rowland was a force of nature, loud, commanding, fearless. But every tough guy has a cost, and every fearless man carries scars the camera doesn't catch. For Hugh, the true toll of his journey didn't always show in busted bumpers or broken bones. It showed in what was lost behind the scenes: the strain on his family, the sacrifices no one celebrated, and the quiet moments where even the polar bear wasn't sure he could keep going. Years on the road meant years away from home. While the TV audience saw adventure, adrenaline, and heated rivalries, they didn't see the holidays missed, the kids growing up without their dad around, or the long nights spent alone in motel rooms, thousands of miles from the people who mattered most. That's the reality for truckers, and Hugh knew it better than anyone. He gave everything to the road: his time, his energy, his body. And for a while, it looked like it had paid off. He was one of the most recognizable faces in reality TV. But when the crash happened and the fame faded, what was left? That's the question that haunted him. When the cameras stopped rolling and the crowds stopped cheering, Hugh was left to face a new challenge: how to rebuild an identity that wasn't built on being invincible. The crash didn't just break his bones, it stripped away the myth. For the first time, he had to be vulnerable. He had to admit he couldn't do it all anymore. That kind of honesty doesn't come easy to a man like Hugh. It took more strength to face that truth than it ever did to drive across a frozen lake at 40 below. And then there was the bitterness. Hugh didn't hide his frustration with how things ended. He felt discarded, used for entertainment, and then cast aside when he could no longer perform. That stung. Not because he wanted sympathy, but because he believed he had earned more than silence. He put his life on the line, not for fame, but for the pride of the work. To be treated like he didn't matter. That left a bruise deeper than any crash could. Still, through all of it, Hugh didn't let himself fall into self-pity. He pushed forward, maybe slower, maybe more quietly, but forward all the same. He stayed connected to fans, stayed involved with trucking in any way he could, and kept living by the same code that had gotten him through the toughest stretches of road. Never show weakness. Keep moving. And don't let anyone write your ending for you. The world saw a hard-charging trucker. But behind the noise and the engine smoke was a man who paid dearly for the life he chose. And while he may have looked unbreakable on TV, the truth is he broke. But then he did something even harder. He stood back up. Even without a network spotlight or a formal farewell, Hugh Rowland never really left the hearts of fans. Years after his final appearance on Ice Road Truckers, people are still talking about him. Old clips resurface on social media. Tributes appear in trucking forums. And anytime someone mentions the show, his name is one of the first that comes up. Because whether the producers admit it or not, Hugh wasn't just part of the show, he was the show. The fan base hasn't forgotten that. His larger-than-life personality, his blunt honesty, his refusal to play it safe. Those weren't just entertaining, they were authentic. And in a world where reality TV is often anything but real, Hugh was the exception. He didn't need a script. He brought the drama just by being himself. That's part of why his departure hit so hard. It didn't just change the cast, it changed the soul of the series. But the story didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. Across the trucking industry, especially in northern Canada and Alaska, Hugh's influence is still felt. Younger drivers mention him when talking about what inspired them to take the wheel. His no-nonsense approach to trucking became a kind of blueprint. Work hard, stay sharp, don't back down. For those who navigate dangerous terrain and brutal winters, that mindset means everything. Even outside of trucking, Hugh's story hits home for a lot of people. He's a reminder of how quickly things can change and how strength isn't just about muscle or swagger. Real strength is surviving the crash, the silence, the erasure, and still holding on to your pride. That message has kept his legacy alive in ways a TV spotlight never could. Some fans have even gone a step further. They've launched tribute videos, online petitions, and commentaries calling for the show to properly acknowledge what Hugh brought to the table. Others simply share their favorite moments, remembering the man who once stared down deadly roads with nothing but a steel rig and pure guts. It's not about nostalgia, it's about respect. What makes Hugh's legacy so unique is that it didn't need to be polished or repackaged. It speaks for itself. Every wild moment, every brutal takedown of a lazy driver, every time he pushed through a blizzard while others hesitated, those things made him unforgettable. He didn't care about being liked. He cared about being real. And that's exactly why people still care. In the end, the show may have moved on, but the audience never did. Because you don't just erase a legend. And if you listen closely to the roar of the engines, the crack of the ice, and the wind howling across the tundra, you can still hear the echo of the polar bear charging forward like he always did. In the world of ice road trucking, the dangers are clear, the roads are slick, the air is freezing, and one mistake can cost everything. But what ice road truckers never fully captured was the danger that comes after the ice. When the lights shut off, the cameras stop rolling, and the fame you never asked for starts slipping through your fingers. That's the road Hugh Rowland had to face. And it might have been the hardest one of all. He rose to fame not because he wanted it, but because he earned it. He didn't audition for the spotlight, he lived the life, and the spotlight found him. Viewers saw the bravado, the confidence, the fire. What they didn't always see was the pressure, the weight of carrying a business, a reputation, and a team through some of the most dangerous conditions on Earth. But Hugh never flinched. He charged into the unknown with steel nerves and a no-nonsense attitude that made him unforgettable. Then came the fall, the accident that changed everything. In a single moment, the unstoppable force hit an immovable wall. The man known for dominating the ice was suddenly fighting a different kind of battle, one against his own body, his career, and the silence of those who once cheered him on. But Hugh didn't stay down. He may have lost his place on the show. He may have been sidelined by the industry, but he never lost his will. And in the end, that's what defines a legend, not how high you rise, but how hard you fight when you fall. Today, Hugh's name still carries weight, not because of a network deal or a viral clip, but because he showed the world what real toughness looks like. He didn't need scripted drama. He was the drama, raw, real, unfiltered. He showed us that courage isn't always loud and heroic. Sometimes it's just getting back up when everything around you says you shouldn't. He reminded people that real men don't hide from danger. They drive straight into it. That loyalty matters. That hard work still means something. And that when the world turns its back, you keep moving forward. Because that's what truckers do. The ice roads may be quieter now. The show might have moved on. But Hugh Rowland's story hasn't ended. It lives on in every rig that starts before dawn. In every young driver who remembers the man who never took a shortcut. In every fan who still goes back to season 1 and sees him, not just the polar bear, but the man who refused to be tamed. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. You can take a man off the ice, but you can never take the ice out of the man.